This episode of Bullet Heaven was made possible with a copy of the game provided by East Asia Soft. So how about them roguelike shmups, hey? They can be played pretty much forever. They often have all kinds of crazy and rare events and power-ups, and they allow for a pretty exciting playthrough every single time. Steriden and its update Binary Stars is perhaps the best known example of a randomized shooter within the confines of a definite structure, but a new challenger approaches. Project Starship is a Yoko vertical roguelite shooting game developed and published by Panda Indie Studio for Windows PC on the 5th of April 2016. As their first project, it would later be published by East Asia Soft for all current consoles, with the PlayStation 4 version launching on February 11th, Xbox One on February 12th, and Nintendo Switch on February 14th, 2020. In this review, we'll be playing the Nintendo Switch version. So, what makes this one tick? Let's take a closer look. There isn't a ton to take into consideration with Project Starship's core gameplay. On the outset of the game, players choose from either Garrett or Gwen to take on the game in either an easy or hard manner. Players control their ship with either the left analog stick or D-pad, fire their main weapons with the B button, and slow their movement with the A button. When moving, the player's shots will also tilt at an angle in the direction the player travels. However, the general movement also has a noticeable inertia to it. Special items are used with the Y button, but more on that in a bit. This is basically all players need to take into consideration with the basic controls. The object of Project Starship is to make it through a set of stages that feature a number of randomly generated adversaries. Enemy patterns, types, and bosses, to an extent, will appear at random every time the player fires up the game. Making it through any playthrough at all can be pretty daunting, but players will come across a number of different power-ups, items, and enhancements that will help them along the way. Some are more common than others, but with the right combination, players can make short work of anything on screen, bosses included. Players can also temporarily boost the power of their ship by collecting an overload pickup. Indicated by a lightning bolt, the game will speed up and the player's firepower will be greatly enhanced for the time that it's active. Items also exist that boost the player's damage and fire rates, add bullet-absorbing barriers, extra turrets, missiles, and more. Exotic things like supercharged lasers, the power of the One Ring, the Devil, or even Cthulhu can greatly boost the general firepower the player will have at their disposal, as well as changing how the player's ship looks. More items are able to be collected and stored in the top right-hand corner of the screen and deployed with the Y button. These can be used defensively or offensively depending on the item collected. Some are better than others. Missile and laser salvos, power overloads, screen-clearing pulses, and more give players some great advantages, but using them to their full potential can be difficult to gauge given the randomized nature of Project Starship. Other items like Bad Driver and TV doesn't work are almost completely to fully completely useless. Any activatable ability that makes the whole screen blank out with static has no place in a single-player shooting game. Thankfully, Project Starship isn't a one-hit kill scenario. Well, mostly, and unless the player wants it to be anyway. Much like Steriden, the player has a life gauge that will allow them to get hit a few times before getting completely wasted. But if the player is feeling spicy, they can pick up the hardcore item to reduce their shields to nothing, right at the outset of the game. In any case, the player will have very little time to recover between hits though, and it's possible to sustain several back-to-back hits that will kill a player off very quickly. There are still some rare insta-kill situations though, so players should obviously be careful. Regardless, players will be able to pick up flashing shield boosters that increase their shield stock by 1 for each collected. This can come in very handy, especially since, later on, things like bullets, enemies, and terrain will get really crowded and very easy to misjudge, especially with the light inertia that the player's ship exhibits when moving around. While Project Starship can be played over and over with a different experience every time, it still has a general formula that it follows. But there's another big way that Project Starship spices things up. As players make their way through the game, every so often a mad event will occur, testing players' skill in various situations. Some are easier to deal with than others, but on the whole it often adds an unexpected twist to any given playthrough. It's totally possible to win in any playthrough, which could be considered a 1LC by design depending on how it's looked at. At the very least, it's absolutely a 1-credit clear. But doing so only once is not nearly the end of what Project Starship offers. Multiple playthroughs which change and increase in difficulty are required to see the real ending of the game. Of course, beyond this, there wasn't much to keep our interest here, especially since the difficulty from one round to the next can vary wildly. In one round, a player can truck along more or less unopposed, but in the next, this shit happens. At least with a game like Steriden, the challenge is more or less evenly applied throughout the whole game, despite being set up in a similar fashion. Another minor sticking point for us is the slow mechanics implementation. In a cave-style game, everything runs at a normal rate while focus fire is initiated, so only the player slows down. But in Project Starship, it seems as if the entire game outside of the sound is underclocked while this is engaged. The player's ship, its shots, and the enemies in their shots all slow down. But outside of this minor gripe and the extreme fluctuation in difficulty from one play to the next, the rest of the game isn't especially offensive from a gameplay mechanics standpoint. Other aspects make it less great, and we'll get to that soon enough, but until such a time, let's talk about Project Starship scoring.
Shield!
The scoring system in Project Starship is simple, but it also isn't a very sure thing. Players will increase their score in two major ways. The first is through enemy kills. Each enemy the player takes out will award a direct score, followed by a secondary score awarded by small orbs that are collected by the player's ship. The second is making it to certain points of each stage. Just before the phase of the stage in question, a number of bonus spheres will be drawn into the player's ship, awarding more points. The problem with all of this is the randomized nature of the game. Each playthrough has very different potential for points throughout the run. There will be runs that are fantastic, but others that will suffer. Granted, the scoring system wasn't of much importance to Panda Indie Studio, as they were aiming for a game that presented a random challenge, not so much for a high score chaser. In the end of it all, the player's high score will be displayed on the title screen before any playthrough. Of course, there are no online leaderboards in the Switch version of Project Starship, but snapshotting an image with the Switch's dedicated capture button is a great way to upload it quickly to like Twitter or something. The presentation in Project Starship is unfortunately on the weak end of the spectrum. Visually speaking, the graphical style employed here is, frankly, a little garish. The color palette is washed out and many visual elements have bright artifacts around them as if they were rough GIFs. The excellent high-quality imagery from the console game's marketing gives way to much less appealing general character design and finally the very crude in-game characters. This may seem a little trivial, especially when so many games were marketed this way since nearly the very beginning, but we kinda wish the quote-unquote cover art was closer to the actual in-game design. The backgrounds can sometimes leave a bit to be desired, like this extremely gray stage, for example. Some hazardous terrain elements can be hard to see as well. Some stages are still pretty neat looking, but like the rest of this game, it lacks consistency. Despite this, some bosses admittedly have some pretty great design. The sound is another sticking point. This is a very loud game, so players are going to want to turn the volume down before playing. The music is overdriven at the main menu, but not terrible at others. The shots have a loud shrill starting effect and a low clicking sound when the fire continues, so it's not exactly great. But at the very least, some of the tunes throughout Project Starship's main stages and bosses aren't terrible. There are also a few VO samples thrown in for good measure, and they are delivered in a decent enough fashion. There really isn't much more to talk about with regards to Project Starship's presentation though, so how does this stack up? Let's take a look. Project Starship has a very simple control scheme that generally works very well. The inertia involved in the tilting fire makes things less precise though. The difficulty of any given run will vary wildly from one playthrough to the next. This can make for impossibly hard situations in some runs, while others will be a total cakewalk. Project Starship lasts 4 stages per play and is required to be cleared multiple times to see the real ending of the game. Replay beyond this may not be a high priority though, even if it is randomly generated every time. The visuals here are on the weak side and a little hard on the eyes. Some stages have literally just one solid color for backdrops. There are some cool music tracks and okay VO here, but the sound in Project Starship is definitely overdriven, loud, and generally rough. The ideas explored in Project Starship are similar to others that we've seen so far on Bullet Heaven, but the multiple end bosses and playthroughs required are a neat twist. The rest is basic and a little lackluster. For just $5, there isn't much to argue about when it comes to value. It's still good enough to warrant a $5, though its staying power is still just a touch questionable. But yeah, the price is definitely right. Project Starship is a game that we were very weary about at first. It took quite a bit of warming up to get to the point where we found the fun bits, even if we don't especially care for its presentation. Ultimately, its upcoming sequel, Project Starship X, currently in early access on Steam, is already a much better game. Will we find out for sure in the future? Stay tuned. For now though, Project Starship is still a fairly decent time for its price, and it gets a 3 out of 5. You can get a copy of Project Starship on pretty much any modern gaming platform for about $5 or less. Link below. Let's keep this thing going. We're going to be isolated for the foreseeable future as it is, so why not get some quality content out there for everyone to enjoy while we're at it? Up next is Cider Reloaded, followed by the physical release of Pixel Heart's Gigantic Army, both for Nintendo Switch.
Be sure to like, comment, and of course, subscribe. We finally got a copy of Hyperduel for the Sega Saturn, and we'll be reviewing it once we hit 10,000 subscribers.